The footman placed the card on the table, and Lady Hortensia Ashburn smiled the way a butcher smiles at a lamb. "There, beside the door, where she belongs." The card read, "Miss Imogen Ashburn," in a hand so small it might have been embarrassed to exist. It had been set at the very end of the long dining table, past the family, past the cousins, past the curate the family barely tolerated, at the chair that, by ancient and unspoken arrangement, was reserved for whichever guest the hostess wished to forget. 3 feet from the servants' entrance, 2 feet from the draught, 1 foot from the kind of social oblivion from which young women, in the year of our Lord 1814, did not return.
And Cordelia, of course, beside his grace. Lady Hortensia continued, her voice warming as it always did when she spoke her elder daughter's name. On his right, closest to the head of the table, so that the conversation flows naturally. "Naturally," murmured Sir Reginald Ashburn, who had not made a natural decision in 31 years of marriage, and did not intend to start now. "And we keep Imogen by the door, in case she becomes—" Lady Hortensia paused, searching for the most genteel cruelty available to her. "Overwhelmed." The butler, a man who had served 3 generations of Ashburns, and had developed, over those decades, the particular blank expression of a servant who has seen too much, said nothing. He simply moved the card a half-inch to the left, as though that small adjustment might somehow soften the blow. It did not. Imogen Ashburn was 22 years old. She had been told, since the age of 12, that she was the plain one, the quiet one, the one who read too much and laughed too rarely, and possessed, in her mother's exact phrasing, the kind of face that does not announce itself. Her sister Cordelia, by contrast, announced herself the way a trumpet announces a parade. Cordelia was 3 years younger, 6 inches taller, and in possession of a laugh that had been described, by no fewer than 4 different country squires, as musical. Cordelia was the one who would marry well. Cordelia was the one whose portrait would hang in the long gallery, beside the great-grandmother's. Cordelia was, in every measurable way, the daughter the Ashbournes had wanted. Imogen was the daughter they had received. And tonight of all nights, Cordelia was to be presented to His Grace, the Duke of Renmere. The Duke of Renmere was 31 years old, unmarried, and in possession of a fortune that made the Ashbournes' considerable estate look like the sort of thing one might find in a tradesman's pocket. He owned 3 estates in Yorkshire, 2 in Kent, 1 in Scotland that he had never visited, and a townhouse in Mayfair that was rumoured to contain a library of 7,000 volumes. He was tall. He was dark. He was, by the unanimous verdict of every matchmaking mother within riding distance of London, the catch of the decade. He was also, according to the same matchmaking mothers, impossible. He did not dance. He did not flirt. He had attended exactly 4 balls in the past 2 years, and at each of them he had stood by the wall, drunk a single glass of wine, exchanged perhaps 11 words with his hostess, and departed before midnight. He had refused, politely but firmly, every introduction the Duchess of Marlborough had attempted to engineer. He had declined 3 private dinners with the Earl of Lansdowne. He had, in the previous season alone, broken the hearts of approximately 14 debutantes, none of whom he had ever spoken to. The general consensus was that the Duke of Renmere was looking for something. The general consensus was also that nobody knew what. And tonight, in the great dining room of Ashburn Hall, Lady Hortensia intended to give it to him. "Cordelia," she said, sweeping into her elder daughter's bedchamber an hour before the guests were to arrive. "Stand up. Turn. Again." Cordelia stood. Cordelia turned. Cordelia was, in the soft amber of the candlelight, breathtaking. She wore a gown of pale ivory silk, embroidered with seed pearls in the pattern of laurel leaves, and her dark hair had been arranged in the exact style that the Princess of Wales had been seen wearing the previous month. Her cheeks were pink, her eyes were bright. She looked, for all the world, like a young woman who had been bred for exactly this purpose, which she had.
"You will laugh," Lady Hortensia instructed, "but only twice. Once when he makes his first observation, and once when he makes his second. After that, you will incline your head and look thoughtful. Men do not wish to feel that they are being laughed at. They wish to feel that they are being understood." "Yes, Mamma." "You will not speak of books." "No, Mamma." "You will not speak of politics, of horses, of the war, or of the price of grain." "No, Mamma." "You will speak of music. You will mention that you play the pianoforte. You will not, under any circumstances, mention your sister." There it was. Cordelia's eyes flickered, briefly, almost imperceptibly, toward the door, toward the corridor, toward the small sitting room at the end of the east wing where, at this very moment, Imogen sat in a faded muslin gown, reading a book she had read 4 times before. "Mamma." "Your sister," Lady Hortensia continued, in the voice she reserved for the discussion of unpleasant household matters, "will be present, of course. One cannot exclude one's own daughter from a family dinner, however much one might wish to. But she will be at the far end of the table. She will not be introduced. She will not be drawn into conversation. She will sit, she will eat, and she will be, as far as His Grace is concerned, a piece of furniture." "Mamma, that is what is best for this family, Cordelia. That is what is best for you. Imogen has had 4 seasons. 4. And not one offer. Not one. Do you understand what that means?" Cordelia, who understood it perfectly well, said nothing. "It means," Lady Hortensia said, lowering her voice to the sort of whisper that the entire household had long ago learned to fear, "that she has had her chance, and she failed. And we will not allow her failure to contaminate yours." She turned. She left. And Cordelia, alone in her bedchamber, sat down on the edge of her bed and stared at her reflection in the looking-glass for a long, long moment. She had loved her sister once. She wondered, now, whether she still did. The carriages began to arrive at 7:30. Imogen heard them from her sitting room, the clatter of hooves on the gravel drive, the murmur of voices, the bright, artificial laughter of women who were pretending to find the journey amusing. She did not look up from her book. She had, over the years, perfected the art of not looking up. It was, she had discovered, the single most useful skill a plain young woman could possess. If you did not look at people, they could not see you looking. And if they could not see you looking, they could not see the part of you that wanted to be looked at in return. She wore, tonight, a gown of pale grey silk that had been her mother's 3 seasons ago, and had been altered twice to fit her smaller frame. It was not a flattering gown. It was not meant to be. Her hair had been pinned up by her maid in a simple knot at the nape of her neck,
and she wore no jewellery, save a small silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother, the only relative, living or dead, who had ever told her she was beautiful. The locket contained no portrait. It had, once, a miniature of her grandmother as a young woman, painted in 1762. But Imogen had taken the miniature out 3 years ago and replaced it with a folded square of paper on which she had written, in her small, embarrassed hand, the single word, "Someday." She did not, herself, know what she meant by it. She only knew that she needed to keep it close. A knock at the door.
Miss Imogen? The voice belonged to Mrs. Pennyquick, the housekeeper, who had been at Ashburn Hall longer than any of the Ashburns themselves, and who possessed, beneath her starched apron, the only kind heart in the household. "Your mother says you are to come down. The guests are arriving." Imogen closed her book. "Thank you, Mrs. Pennyquick." "And Miss Imogen?" The housekeeper hesitated in the doorway, with the expression of a woman who has something she very much wishes to say, and very much knows she cannot. "Whatever happens tonight, you hold your head up. Do you hear me? You hold your head up." Imogen, who had been holding her head up for 22 years, and was beginning to feel the strain of it, smiled. "I shall try, Mrs. Pennyquick. You will succeed." The housekeeper turned and was gone, and Imogen Ashburn, with the small silver locket warm against her collarbone, and the faint scent of her grandmother's lavender water still clinging to its chain, rose from her chair and went down to dinner. The drawing-room of Ashburn Hall, on the evening of the 15th of September, 1814, contained 18 people. It contained Sir Reginald and Lady Hortensia Ashburn, who stood near the fire with the practised stillness of 2 predators waiting for their prey to enter the clearing. It contained Cordelia Ashburn, in her ivory silk and her seed pearls, who stood 3 paces behind her mother, and whose hands, beneath the careful arrangement of her shawl, were trembling. It contained the Bishop of Lincoln, who was a cousin of Sir Reginald, and who had been brought down from London for the express purpose of lending the evening an air of ecclesiastical respectability. It contained Lord and Lady Marchwood, neighbours and old family friends, whose presence was meant to suggest that the Ashburns were the sort of people whose dinner parties were attended by old family friends. It contained the Marchwood's son, a foolish young man named Cyril, who had been making sheep's eyes at Cordelia for the past 3 years, and who had been included tonight, Lady Hortensia had explained, to provide a useful contrast. It contained the curate, who did not know why he was there. It contained 4 other guests of varying social utility. It contained Imogen, who stood by the window, slightly apart, with a glass of ratafia she did not intend to drink, and an expression she had been wearing for so long she had forgotten what her face looked like underneath it. And then, at 1 minute past 8 o'clock, the butler opened the doors and announced, "His Grace, the Duke of Renmere." The room fell silent. Imogen did not look up. She had been instructed, very specifically, not to look up. She had been instructed not to look at His Grace, not to attempt to catch His Grace's eye, not to do anything that might draw His Grace's attention away from her sister. And so, she stared down at her glass of ratafia and watched the candlelight catch in the amber liquid, and tried very hard, not to feel the way her heart had begun, quite without her permission, to beat against her ribs. She heard her mother's voice, bright, practiced, almost musical. "Your Grace, we are so very honoured. May I present my elder daughter, Miss Cordelia Ashbourne?"
A silence. A short, formal silence, of the kind that occurs when a powerful man performs a small social courtesy. Miss Ashburn. The voice, when she heard it, was not what she had expected. It was deep. It was quiet. It carried, beneath its careful politeness, the faintest possible suggestion of a man who would rather have been anywhere else in England. "Your Grace," Cordelia replied, in the voice she had been rehearsing for 3 weeks. "We are so pleased that you could come." "You are very kind." That was all. Imogen, still staring at her ratafia, found herself, against every instruction she had ever been given, looking up. He was tall. That was the first thing. He was very tall. Taller than her father, taller than the bishop, taller than any other man in the room. And he stood near the doorway with the slight, contained stillness of a man who was used to being looked at, and had long ago decided not to look back. His hair was dark. His coat was black. His face was the kind of face that, in another century, might have been carved into the prow of a ship and sent out to terrify foreign navies. He was not handsome, exactly. He was something more dangerous than handsome. He was severe. He had the kind of face that made a young woman's first thought, "I should not look at him," and her second thought, "I cannot look away." And he was looking, Imogen realized with a small jolt of horror, at her. For perhaps half a second, no more. His eyes, and they were very dark, almost black in the candlelight, moved across the room with the careful, unhurried sweep of a man making an inventory. They passed over Lady Marchwood. They passed over the bishop. They paused, very briefly, on Cordelia. And then, as if drawn by some small magnetic disturbance in the air, they came to rest, for a single half-second, on the girl by the window in the faded grey silk. He inclined his head. It was the smallest possible movement, so small that nobody else in the room saw it, so small that Imogen herself was not entirely sure it had happened. But it had happened. And then he turned and was introduced to Lord Marchwood, and the moment was gone. But Imogen Ashburn, who had not been seen by anyone in 22 years, suddenly understood what it was to be seen, and she was terrified. Dinner was announced at 8:15. The procession into the dining room was a carefully orchestrated thing. The bishop at its head, with Lady Hortensia on his arm, Sir Reginald escorting the Duchess mother of one of the lesser guests, Cordelia placed, with an almost military precision, on the arm of the Duke himself. Imogen entered last. She entered behind the curate. This was, the bishop noted with some private discomfort, an unusual arrangement. A daughter of the house, even a younger one, ought by rights to have entered ahead of a curate. But the bishop had been at Ashbourne Hall before, and he had observed the Ashbournes' particular arrangements for their younger daughter, and he had long ago decided that it was not his business. He was wrong, as it turned out, but he could not have known that yet. The dining room of Ashbourne Hall was 42 feet long, panelled in walnut, lit by 3 crystal chandeliers and 48 wax candles that had been imported, at considerable expense, from a chandler in Bruges. The table beneath them was set for 18. 18 places, 18 cards, 18 carefully calibrated arrangements of silver and porcelain and Bohemian crystal. The Duke's place was at the head, on Sir Reginald's right. Cordelia's place was beside the Duke's, and Imogen's place. Imogen's place was at the very end of the table, 3 feet from the servants' entrance, between the curate and an empty chair. She saw the arrangement before she reached her seat. She understood it before she sat down. She had been, by the deliberate and unspoken calculation of her mother, banished. Not from the dinner, which would have been impossible, but from any meaningful proximity to it. She would sit. She would eat. She would, in the words her mother had used to her sister an hour earlier, be a piece of furniture. She lowered herself into her chair. She placed her hands in her lap. She stared down at the white linen of the tablecloth and waited for the soup. And it was at this point, at this precise, unremarkable, structurally engineered point, that something unprecedented occurred. The Duke of Renmere, who had taken his seat at the head of the table beside Miss Cordelia Ashburn, and who had, for the past 45 seconds, been making the polite and conventional remarks that a man of his rank was expected to make to the elder daughter of his hostess, set down his glass. He looked, very briefly, down the length of the table. He looked at the empty chair beside the girl in the grey silk, and he stood up. There are, in the ordinary social fabric of Regency England, certain things that simply do not happen. A duke does not, having been seated at the head of a dining table, rise from his seat before the soup has been served. A duke does not, having been placed beside the elder daughter of his hostess, abandon her in the middle of a sentence. A duke does not, in full view of 18 guests and a household of 20 servants, walk the entire length of a 42-foot dining table, draw out the empty chair at the very end, and sit down beside the daughter who has been deliberately exiled to the door. These things do not happen. They cannot happen. And yet, on the evening of the 15th of September, 1814, in the dining room of Ashbourne Hall in the county of Hertfordshire, they happen. The first person to notice was the butler, who was in the act of pouring wine into Lord Marchwood's glass, and who, very nearly, for the first time in 31 years of service, spilled it. The second person to notice was Lady Hortensia Ashburn. Her face, and Imogen, who saw it, would remember the precise arrangement of its features for the rest of her life, went through 3 distinct expressions in the space of perhaps 2 seconds. The first was confusion. The second was disbelief. The third was the particular frozen, white-lipped horror of a woman watching her entire carefully constructed evening collapse, in real time, into a kind of social rubble from which there could be no recovery. The third person to notice was Cordelia. Cordelia's expression did not change. Cordelia, in fact, did something extraordinary. Cordelia Ashburn, who had been bred for exactly this evening, and who had every conceivable reason to be devastated by what was occurring, looked down the length of the table at her sister, at Imogen, whose face had gone the colour of the white linen tablecloth, and whose hands had begun, beneath the table, to shake. And Cordelia smiled. It was a small smile. It was a private smile. It was the smile of a younger sister who has been waiting for a very long time for someone to recognize what she herself has always known. And then the Duke of Renmere reached the end of the table, drew out the chair, and sat down. "Miss Ashburn," he said, in the same low, quiet voice he had used in the drawing room. "Forgive me. I believe I have been seated, by some small error of arrangement, rather further from the conversation than I should like. May I impose?" Imogen, who could not speak, who could not breathe, who could not, for a long, terrible moment, even remember her own name, managed, barely, to incline her head. "Thank you," said the Duke. He sat. And the dinner that Lady Hortensia Ashburn had spent 6 weeks planning began, very quietly and very thoroughly, to come apart. But this is where things get crazy. Because the Duke of Renmere did not, having taken his seat beside Imogen Ashbourne, simply make small talk and return to his proper place at the head of the table. He did not apologize to Sir Reginald for the disruption. He did not glance, even once, in the direction of Cordelia.
He did not give any indication, by word or gesture or expression, that he intended to behave as though anything in the room was occurring except the conversation he was now having with the girl in the grey silk gown by the door. He stayed. Through the soup, he stayed. Through the fish, he stayed. Through the entree and the remove and the second course of partridge in a sauce that the cook had been weeping over for 3 days, he stayed. He spoke to her quietly. He listened to her with the kind of attention that no man, in 22 years, had ever paid her. He asked her what she had been reading. He asked her, and this was when Imogen first began to suspect that something very strange was happening. He asked her, with the faintest possible smile at the corner of his severe mouth, whether she had ever been to the lending library at Hatchard's in Piccadilly, and whether she had read the new volume of Wordsworth that had been published in the spring. She had. She had, in fact, read it twice. She told him so. And the Duke of Renmere, who had not smiled by reliable account in any drawing-room in London for the better part of 3 years, laughed. It was a quiet laugh. It was not a public laugh. But it was a laugh. And Lady Hortensia Ashburn, who heard it from the head of the table, closed her eyes and felt the entire architecture of her ambitions shift, very subtly, beneath her feet. By the time the dessert was served, the dinner had divided itself into 2 entirely separate events. At the head of the table, Sir Reginald Ashburn and the Bishop of Lincoln were attempting, with the desperate cheerfulness of 2 men holding back a rising tide, to discuss the harvest. Cordelia, beside an empty chair where the Duke ought to have been, was being entertained by the foolish young Cyril Marchwood, who was visibly delighted with this unexpected reversal of his fortunes, and who had begun, with no encouragement whatsoever, to recite a poem of his own composition. Lady Hortensia was eating very slowly. Lady Hortensia was eating, in fact, the way a woman eats when she has decided that if she stops moving her jaw, even for an instant, she may scream. At the foot of the table, in the chair 3 feet from the servants' entrance, the Duke of Renmere was asking Imogen Ashbourne what she thought of the second canto of Wordsworth's Excursion. She told him. She told him at some length. She told him, with a precision and a passion that startled her almost as much as it startled him, that she thought the second canto was a failure of nerve, that the poet had reached for a question that frightened him, and had, at the last moment, retreated into platitude. She told him that she preferred the first canto, where the poet was still afraid. She told him that she believed all great poetry came from fear, and that the moment a poet became comfortable with his own answers, he ceased to be a poet at all, and became a clergyman. The Duke listened. The Duke, when she had finished, was silent for a long moment. And then he said, very quietly, "Miss Ashburn, where have you been?" She did not understand the question. She did not understand it at first, but she would, eventually, understand it. She would understand it 3 weeks later, in a library in Berkeley Square, when the Duke of Renmere would tell her, quietly and without preamble, and with the kind of directness that would set the entire course of her life on a different path, that he had been looking, for the better part of 2 years, for a woman who could speak to him about Wordsworth in exactly the way she had spoken to him at her parents' dinner table. He would tell her that he had attended 4 balls in 2 years and not found her.
He would tell her that he had endured 14 private dinners and not found her. He would tell her that he had been on the verge, when his mother had insisted he accept Sir Reginald Ashburn's invitation, of giving the entire enterprise up as hopeless. And he would tell her, and this was the part that would, eventually, undo her completely, that he had walked into the drawing room of Ashburn Hall and seen, by the window, a girl in a grey silk gown who was not looking at him, and he had known, with the certainty that men of his rank only know perhaps once or twice in a lifetime, that he had finally arrived in the right room. But all of that was 3 weeks away. Tonight, on the 15th of September, 1814, with the second course being cleared and the candles burning low, and her mother staring at her plate as though it had betrayed her personally, Imogen Ashbourne only knew that the Duke of Renmere had asked her a question, and she did not know how to answer it. She said, very quietly, "I have been here, Your Grace." He looked at her. For a long moment he simply looked at her. And then he said, "I think we shall have to do something about that." What happened next is the part of the story that, in later years, would be told and retold in every drawing room in 3 counties. What happened next is the part that the Marchwoods would dine out on for 15 years. What happened next is the part that Lady Hortensia Ashburn would refuse for the rest of her life to speak of, and that Cordelia would speak of on the rare occasions when she spoke of it at all, with a small private smile and a single sentence. It was the night my sister learned how to be seen. What happened next was that the Duke of Renmere, having finished his dessert, set down his spoon, rose from his chair, and turned to address the entire table. The room fell silent. A duke, when he rises at the dinner table, is not interrupted. "Sir Reginald," said the Duke, "Lady Ashburn, I must beg your forgiveness for what I am about to say. It is not, I am aware, conventional. But I find that I have reached an age at which convention is rather less important to me than I once supposed." He paused. Not a fork moved. "I came tonight," he continued, "at the kind invitation of your family, and at the considerable urging of my own mother, who has formed strong opinions on the subject of my continued bachelorhood. I came, I confess, with very little expectation of pleasure. I have attended a great many dinners in the past several years, and I have, almost without exception, regretted them." A nervous laugh from Lord Marchwood. The Duke did not smile. Tonight, however, has been an exception. Tonight I have had the very great honour of making the acquaintance of a young woman whose conversation has given me more genuine pleasure than I have known in some considerable time. I refer, of course, and here, for the first time, he turned and looked directly at her, to your younger daughter, Miss Imogen Ashbourne. The silence that followed was the silence of a household that has just felt the foundations move. Lady Hortensia Ashburn, at the head of the table, made a small sound that was not quite a word. The Duke continued. "I am aware," he said, "that I have spent the entirety of this evening at the foot of your table, and that this has been, by your own arrangement, a position not generally held to be one of honour. I am aware also that there has been some confusion regarding the seating. I wish to make my position clear, for the avoidance of any further confusion." He turned and addressed Imogen directly. "Miss Ashburn, with your parents' permission, and I do hope I shall have it, I should like to call upon you tomorrow." He paused. "And," he added, in a voice that was now perfectly audible to everyone in the room, "every day thereafter, for as long as you find my company tolerable. And that's not even the worst part. Because the worst part, the part that Lady Hortensia Ashburn would, in years to come, struggle most to explain, was what happened next. What happened next was that the curate, who had been seated on Imogen's other side, and who had until this moment said almost nothing, leaned forward and quietly murmured, "I think, Miss Ashburn, you are required to answer." What happened next was that Imogen, with her hands trembling beneath the table and her grandmother's locket warm against her collarbone, looked up at the Duke of Renmere. What happened next was that she said, in a voice that was small but did not waver, "Your Grace, I should like that very much." What happened next was that Cordelia Ashbourne, at the head of the table beside an empty chair, began very softly and very deliberately to applaud. And what happened next, after that, was that one by one, the bishop first, then Lord Marchwood, then Lady Marchwood, then the curate, then the foolish young Cyril, then every other guest at the table, they all began to applaud. Every one of them. Except Lady Hortensia Ashburn, who sat at the head of the table with her hands folded in her lap and her face as white as the linen, and who understood, with a clarity that only the very thoroughly defeated can know, that she had lost. She had lost completely. She had lost in front of the Bishop of Lincoln. And she had lost. This was the part that would, in later years, hurt her most. To a daughter she had spent 22 years convincing herself was not worth losing to. But before we get to what happened the next morning, and it was, as you may imagine, a morning of some considerable consequence, we must pause and consider what had been happening for the past several weeks beneath the surface of the household at Ashburn Hall. Because the Duke of Renmere had not arrived at Ashburn Hall by accident. He had arrived, in fact, because of a very specific letter. The letter had been written 6 weeks earlier in the small sitting room at the end of the East Wing by a young woman who had borrowed her sister's writing case and her sister's seal, and who had, in the kind of impulsive act that young women in faded grey silk do not generally commit, sent a letter to a man she had never met. The letter had been signed C. Ashburn. It had not, strictly speaking, been signed by Cordelia. It had been signed by Cordelia's younger sister, who had heard, from Mrs. Pennyquick, who had heard it from her cousin, who was a cook in the kitchen of the Renmere townhouse in Mayfair, that His Grace, the Duke of Renmere, was looking for a wife, who could speak intelligently about poetry, and who was tired of the kind of women who could not. The letter had been a single page. It had asked the Duke a single question. It had asked, "Your Grace, what do you think of the second canto of Wordsworth's Excursion?" It had been signed C. Ashburn because Imogen had not dared to sign her own name, and the Duke of Renmere, who had received, in the previous season alone, 416 letters from young women, none of whom had asked him a single interesting question, had read it twice, and then a third time, and had then, very quietly, instructed his secretary to find out everything he could about the Ashburn family of Hertfordshire. The secretary had been thorough. The secretary had reported back, 3 days later, that the Ashburns had 2 daughters, an elder, Cordelia, aged 19, of whom the secretary's contacts in London spoke in glowing and entirely conventional terms, and a younger, Imogen, aged 22, of whom nobody seemed to speak at all. The Duke had read the report. The Duke had thought, for a long time, about the difference between the daughter everyone spoke of and the daughter nobody did. The Duke had then done something he had not done in 2 years. The Duke had written to his mother. The Duke had asked his mother to procure, by whatever means she thought fit, an invitation to dinner at Ashburn Hall. His mother had been delighted. His mother, in fact, had begun planning the wedding before the invitation had even been answered. But the Duke himself, the Duke, who was a careful man and a thorough man, and a man who had been disappointed too many times by women who looked promising on paper, the Duke had told no one, not even his mother, the real reason for his interest. He had told no one about the letter. He had told no one about the question. He had simply accepted the invitation and dressed himself in his black coat and travelled the 43 miles from London to Hertfordshire with a letter folded in his breast pocket and a single thought in his head. The thought was, I shall know her when I hear her speak. And he had. He had walked into the drawing room of Ashburn Hall, and he had been introduced to the elder daughter, and he had listened, for 37 seconds, to her practiced remarks about the weather and the journey from London. And he had known, within those 37 seconds, with an absolute and unshakable certainty, that the elder daughter had not written the letter. And he had begun, very quietly, to look around the room. And he had found, by the window, a girl in a faded grey silk gown who was holding a small silver locket in her left hand, and who was, very deliberately, not looking at him. And he had known. He had known the way men of his particular temperament always know. Now, the next morning. The next morning began, for Lady Hortensia Ashburn, at 6 o'clock, with the realization that she had not slept and was not going to.
It continued at 7:30 with the discovery by her maid, who had it from the housekeeper, who had it from the head footman, that a carriage bearing the Wrenmere arms had been seen, at first light, turning into the long drive. By 8 o'clock, the carriage was at the door. By 1:15, the Duke of Wrenmere was in the morning room. By 1:30, he had been received by Sir Reginald Ashburn, who had not yet finished his coffee, and who looked, as his daughter Cordelia would later observe, like a man who has been told that his house is on fire, and has not yet decided whether to be alarmed. The interview between Sir Reginald and the Duke lasted 22 minutes. What was said in it was never, in later years, fully recounted by either party, but the effect of it was visible to everyone in the household. When Sir Reginald emerged, he was pale. He went directly to his wife's sitting room. He closed the door behind him, and the conversation that followed, though it was conducted in voices low enough that even Mrs. Pennyquick, listening with all the practiced skill of 40 years in service, could not make out the precise words, lasted for the better part of an hour. What Mrs. Pennyquick could hear, however, was the moment, near the end, when Lady Hortensia began to weep. It was not a graceful weeping. It was the weeping of a woman who had, for 22 years, told herself a particular story about her younger daughter, and who had now been forced, quite against her will, and at the worst possible moment, to recognize that the story had been wrong. She wept for some considerable time, and then, when she had finished weeping, she did the only thing that a woman of her particular character could do under the circumstances. She rose, she washed her face, she arranged her hair, and she descended the stairs to the morning room, where the Duke of Wrenmere was waiting, and where Imogen, who had been summoned by Mrs. Pennyquick at 20 minutes past 8, had been sitting for some 40 minutes in a state of such complete and utter bewilderment that she had not been able to drink the cup of tea that had been placed before her. Lady Hortensia Ashburn entered the morning room. She stood for a long moment in the doorway. She looked at her younger daughter, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in many years, and she saw, with a clarity that only the recently humbled can see, the woman her daughter had become.
She saw the small silver locket at Imogen's throat. She saw the steady hands. She saw the eyes. And they were her grandmother's eyes, she realized, with a small, fresh stab of feeling, that were no longer afraid. And Lady Hortensia Ashburn, who had spent 22 years engineering her younger daughter's invisibility, walked across the morning room and did something she had not done since Imogen was 4 years old. She kissed her on the forehead. "Forgive me," she said. It was not enough. It would never, Imogen would think later, in the years to come, be quite enough. But it was, at that particular moment, on that particular morning, the beginning of something. And the Duke of Renmere, who had been watching the entire exchange in respectful silence, rose from his chair and said, very quietly, "Lady Ashburn, with your permission, I should like to take Miss Imogen for a walk in the rose garden. The morning is fine, and I find I have a great deal to say to her." Lady Hortensia inclined her head. She did not speak. She could not, at that moment, trust herself to speak. And Imogen Ashburn, who had walked into the dining room of her parents' house the previous evening as a piece of furniture, and who was now walking out of it, on the arm of a duke, into a morning so bright and so clear and so wholly unexpected, that it did not seem quite to belong to her own life, paused in the doorway. She turned. She looked back at her mother, and she said, quietly and without rancor, and with the small, clear voice of a woman who had finally, after 22 years, learned what it was to speak, "I forgive you, Mamma." And then she walked out. The rose garden at Ashburn Hall in the September of 1814 was at the end of its season. The blooms were past their best. The petals on the pale pink Bourbon roses had begun to brown at the edges, and the great, climbing white roses on the south wall had shed half their flowers onto the gravel path. A gardener was at work at the far end, tying back the canes for winter. The Duke of Renmere offered Imogen his arm. She took it. They walked for some time in silence. It was the silence of two people who had a great deal to say, and who had not yet decided which of them should say the first thing. Eventually the Duke said, "I had a letter." "Yes," said Imogen. "You wrote it?" "Yes." "You signed it with your sister's name?" "Yes." "Why?" Imogen looked, for a long moment, at the brown-edged petals of the Bourbon roses. The locket was warm at her throat, her grandmother's locket. The locket that had, for 3 years, contained nothing but the folded paper on which she had written, "Someday." "Because," she said, "I did not believe, Your Grace, that anyone would read a letter signed with mine." The Duke stopped walking. He turned. He looked at her in the morning light with an expression that she would, in later years, struggle to describe, though she would try, often, in the small hours of the night when she could not sleep, and the candle was guttering, and the man beside her was breathing slowly in the dark. The closest she would ever come to describing it would be, "He looked at me as though I had been there all along, and he had only just been allowed to see me." "Miss Ashburn," he said, "I read it 3 times. "Did you?" "I have it, in fact, in my pocket. I have carried it with me every day for 6 weeks." He reached into the breast of his coat. He drew out a folded sheet of paper. It was a little worn at the edges. It had been read, she could see, a great many more times than 3. "I should like to know," he said very quietly, "whether you would do me the very great honor of allowing me to read it again this afternoon in your company, and every afternoon for as long as you find my company tolerable. And he paused, and his severe face softened into something that, on any other man, might have been called a smile. If I am very fortunate, Miss Ashburn, for rather longer than that. She did not speak. She could not, at that moment, speak. But she reached up with her free hand, and she touched the small silver locket at her throat. And the Duke of Renmere, who had, the previous evening, walked the length of a 42-foot dining table to sit beside a girl who had been told, since the age of 12, that she was not worth looking at, reached up and very gently, with the tip of one gloved finger, traced the chain of the locket along her collarbone. "What does it contain?" he asked. She told him. She told him about her grandmother.
She told him about a miniature she had taken out 3 years before. She told him about the folded square of paper and the single word she had written on it, and the years she had carried it close to her heart, without quite knowing why. The Duke listened. The Duke, when she had finished, was silent for a long moment. And then he said, "Miss Ashburn, may I ask, what was the word?" She looked up at him. She looked up at this severe, dark, impossible man who had walked the length of her parents' dining table for her. And she said, very quietly, "It was Sunday, Your Grace." He took her hand. He raised it, very slowly, to his lips. "Miss Ashburn," he said, "I believe today is the day." They were married in the spring of 1815 at St. George's in Hanover Square. The ceremony was performed by the Bishop of Lincoln, who had, by his own admission, in a sermon delivered some weeks later, never officiated at a wedding with greater pleasure. The bride wore ivory silk. The bride wore, also, around her neck, a small silver locket on a fine chain, which had been opened the morning of the ceremony, and into which had been placed a folded square of paper. The paper no longer read, "Someday." It read, in a hand that was no longer small or embarrassed, "Today." Cordelia Ashburn, who had by this time become engaged to a young naval officer of considerable promise and even more considerable charm, and who would, in the fullness of time, become Lady Cordelia Hartwell and the mistress of an estate in Devon, stood beside her sister at the altar. She did not weep. Cordelia, in her elder sister's later judgment, had not wept since the night of the dinner at Ashburn Hall, and she was not going to start now. She simply stood and smiled and held her sister's bouquet. Lady Hortensia Ashburn wept enough for both of them. She wept, in fact, for most of the ceremony. She wept, Imogen would later observe, with the particular thoroughness of a woman who had come, very late, to an understanding of her own daughter, and who was making up, through tears alone, since she could not now make up through years, for everything that had been lost. Sir Reginald gave his daughter away. He did so, by all accounts, with considerable dignity. The Marchwoods attended. The foolish young Cyril Marchwood, who had within 6 months of the dinner at Ashbourne Hall transferred his affections to a young lady in Bath, attended as well, and danced, at the wedding breakfast, with such enthusiasm that he was eventually requested, by his own mother, to sit down. The curate, who had been transferred to a more prosperous living shortly after the dinner, and who had often, in private, taken some quiet credit for his small intervention at the table, was also present. And in the front pew, in a black silk gown and a hat of considerable magnificence, sat the Dowager Duchess of Renmere, the Duke's mother.
who had read her son's letter requesting the invitation to Ashburn Hall, and who had known, the moment she read it, that she had finally won. She had not, of course, won. The girl who had won was sitting at the altar. But the Dowager Duchess, who was a generous woman and a wise one, had long since learned the difference between winning and being on the winning side. And she was, this morning, very firmly on the winning side. And she wept, too, though more elegantly than Lady Hortensia, and in considerably less quantity. Many years later, many years later, when their eldest daughter was 22 years old and was being courted with very serious intentions by a young man whom her father had vetted with the kind of thoroughness usually reserved for treaties with foreign powers, the Duchess of Renmere was found one evening in the library at Renmere House, reading a letter. Her husband came in. He saw the letter. He smiled, that same severe, contained smile that he had been smiling only for her for 31 years. "Still reading it?" he said. "Still." He sat down beside her. He took her hand. He looked for a long moment at the small silver locket at her throat, which she had never, in 31 years, taken off. "You know," he said, "I have always wondered, what would you have written if you had signed the letter with your own name?" She thought about it. She thought about it for a long time. And then she said, quietly, and with the small, clear voice that she had learned in the rose garden at Ashburn Hall on a September morning 31 years before, "I should have written exactly the same thing, Your Grace. I should only have signed it differently." He raised her hand to his lips. "And yet," he said, "I should have read it just the same." And the candles burned low in the library at Renmere House. And the rain began, very softly, against the great windows. And the Duke of Renmere, who had once walked the length of a 42-foot dining table for a girl in a faded grey silk gown, sat with his wife's hand in his and watched the firelight catch in the silver chain at her throat, and thought, as he had thought every day for 31 years, that there had never been, in the whole of England, in the whole of his own long and fortunate life, a more remarkable woman. And she, who had been told for the first 22 years of her life that she was not worth looking at, leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. And she was seen. She was, at last, completely and entirely and forever seen.